Hello, everyone. My name is Rick van Bruggen from Neo Technology, and here I am again, the third time in 2 days. This is wonderful. I'm on a roll here, recording another podcast for our Neo4j Graphistania podcast. And today I have a fellow Belgian on the other side of this Skype call, and that's Kristof Van Tomme from Pronovix. Hi, Kristof.
Good morning, Rick.
Hey,
How
good
are you?
morning. I'm really well, and I hope the Skype gods bear with us
Yes.
because we've had
Yeah.
some trouble in the past couple of minutes, but I'm sure it will be fine. Hey, Christoph, we met each other at the FOSDEM conference,
Yes.
which was a great experience, and I loved the beer fest afterwards.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, you told me about some really great stuff that you guys are doing with graph databases. So first of all, let's start at the beginning. Who are you? What do you do? And what's your relationship to the wonderful world of graphs?
So I'm a bit of a weird duck because I'm actually a bioengineer who ended up in IT through a biotech startup that did research in schizophrenia. It's a whole other life.
Wow. Yeah, yeah.
um, but I got involved in the Drupal community a little over 10 years ago. Um, when we started making websites for biotech companies.
Okay.
And
Drupal is like a content management system, right?
yes,
It's
Drupal, the open source content management
yeah,
system, the other really good Belgian product after beer
exactly. Yes.
and chocolates. so and I got really strongly involved in that community 10 years ago. Like I helped organize one of the big European conferences, and then we built a consultancy around that. Then about 5 years ago, I got really excited about documentation and reuse of documentation specifically, and how to deliver it and reuse bits and pieces so that you could build deliverables that can be easily reused between different channels. And that's how I got like excited about graph databases and Neo and specifically.
When you say
Uh,
documentation, you mean technical documentation for software, right?
yes,
Or
yes.
okay. Yeah.
The thing that everybody's like, ooh, documentation.
Damn it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's how I got involved in because we had one of our colleagues like a long time ago, I think 6 years ago or something, started playing with graph databases, and actually he built the first connector for Drupal for Neo, and he's like, oh, Kristof, I did this thing, and I'm really excited about graph databases, and I think it's cool. Like, do, can we do something with this? And I was like, I have no idea. so,
Yeah.
so that was like the first connector for Neo for Drupal, and then that kind of like died because there was it was not, how to say, technically it was there, but then there were no further implementations, and it was not sold, and
Sure.
people didn't figure out how to use it.
Mhm.
But then because of the documentation thing, I actually started seeing like what you would use a graph database for, and that's when I got really excited.
Super cool. It's because I mean the documentation. I don't know if you noticed, but this is where Neo4j started as well. As an open source project. 15 years ago, Viking hackers in a garage. They were all about content management at the time as well. Because they were working for a media company that was managing digital assets. So it's funny that there's this convergence or link between the two worlds, right?
Yeah.
What is the use case all about? What does it work? How
Um,
does it work?
so I've been thinking. So I've got this uh, uh, DITA, which is another of those words. It's a standard that's really, well, fairly popular in the technical writing community for writing reusable documentation. It's like an XML standard. It's
Okay.
some people scratch their heads when they hear about it, and other people are raving mad about it. So in the DITA community, I've been doing talks about content management systems and open source and things like that. And I think 2 years ago, I started thinking about personalization and embedding information. So that like what I dream about is this like instead of having a manual, that the documentation system knows who you are and serves you the right information like when you need it. So now I did a talk about that at the DTA conference here. I think it was in Europe, and then I was thinking like, so how would you do that? And then I started thinking like, yeah, actually, probably it wouldn't really work with a relational database, because you need to start collecting a whole lot of information and start analyzing for patterns. And that's how I started thinking about Neo and graph databases more in general.
So as a personalization engine for documentation, right? So that
Yeah,
you wouldn't need to search for documentation as much, but
yeah,
you would have like a recommended set of documentations that would be served to you semi-automatically.
yeah. So it's the idea that, like for example, you're in an application, like you're in a web app, and you can't find that one damn button that you know it's
We've
somewhere.
all been there.
Yeah, we've all been there. And so you're clicking around and you're like going through settings, then to, I don't know, connections. And so you keep like going circles and circles and circles because you can't find the damn button. And that at that point, the system would say like, oh, this looks a lot like what people do when they're looking for this thing.
Yeah.
And then you get a little pop-up saying like, hey, are you maybe looking for this? And then, and similarly, if you're using a certain feature and you're doing something really weird, and other people have done that, and then
Sure.
they went to the documentation and found some other feature, then you could shortcut that and like skip a few jumps in the graph, and immediately serve them the information that they're looking for. So it's kind of like analyzing patterns of behavior that people have inside of a web application, and then serving them that's like patterns of behavior that they normally do just before going to the documentation site.
Yep.
And then serving them that documentation that people normally will find when they go to the documentation site after they've done a certain thing, and then serving that information to them. So that's kind of like what I that's one of the really cool things that I would like to do. So,
Yeah, I understand.
yeah.
And so why is that such a good use case for a graph database? Is that because of the pattern recognition, or
Yeah.
what's the secret sauce?
So it's a pattern recognition. So I think CMSs are really good at storing data in storing similarly structured information, because most of CMSs use SQL databases, and they're pretty good at that, like just building up a content
Totally.
model and then reusing that over and over again. But that's like being able to recognize behavior. That's not something that we are normally doing in the CMS space. We have some very basic things like there's some recommendation based on content and shared keywords and things like that. But behavior analysis is not one of the things that you normally find in the CMS. So, and that's so for that we need different technology, because you in a SQL database you would have to do so many joins to like even figure out what's going on. That I don't think that it would make sense to do it that way. And ideally it would be a system that you don't have to program everything, but that it can start looking for patterns on its own eventually, and that you build this graph of interactions and content, and kind of like a graph that combines those two to do things with that. So
where are you guys with this? How far along that path are you? I know you've done some prototyping already, right?
Yeah. So we're very, very early. So our main business right now is developer portals. So we've specialized. 2 years ago, we started working. A year and a half ago, we started working with Apigee. That's now part of Google. And they have a developer portal that we are customizing for their customers, and we built this whole business around documentation specifically about APIs. So that's where our core focus is right now. Yep. So the AI and personalized documentation is something that we're doing research on. So the thing we've done currently is we've built a connector for Drupal for Neo. I did a talk about that at Volkswagen, and that was
Put a
like
link to that one, yeah.
yeah. So it was, that talk was not just about this use case. It was about, what could you do if you combine a CMS and a graph database,
Hmm.
and like, and looking at it from an added value perspective rather than a replacement perspective,
Hmm.
because I know that in the Neo community, people are like, just get rid of the stupid SQL databases.
Yeah,
they're worthless, and graph databases can do everything so much better. I think
that's a pipe dream in my book, but
yeah,
anyway, yeah.
probably. So
Yeah.
I'm also like, I you could build a CMS with a graph database, and I think that could work. But I think that there's so much existing technology already, with a large amount of extensions and huge communities, that it would make more sense to like create an add-on instead of a replacement. Because if you replace it, then you have to rewrite everything.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's why I think that the sweet spot for Neo in the CMS community. I think there's two aspects to this. One is like the sweet spot for Neo in the CMS community, and that could be like recommendation and pattern finding.
Hmm.
Um, but then there's also the inverse that you could think about, and that's like, what if you would put an open source CMS like Drupal in front of a graph database, and we'd use it as an interface to manipulate the graph and to add maybe sometimes some structured objects into your graph, and then use the CMS to build reports about those objects, and the graph to find out like which ones you're going to put into your reports. So that was my talk about.
Well, you've already touched on my last question, which is, what does the future hold? What could we do in the future? And I know that we'll be doing some meetups together, and I'm really looking forward to those. But where does this go, Kristof? What's in your crystal ball?
So I love thinking about the future. So uh, I really love Kevin Kelly's book, The Inevitable,
Hmm.
and in that book he talked about. I think that this is the basic pattern that got me thinking about this also. He talks about flowing, and it's a very very interesting concept that we're moving from an internet where we used to have documents to an internet where we have pages today, where we'll have flows of information tomorrow. And this idea of going from having an object that's structured and that has a context, like has a manual context or like a book context, or a document context, where you put all the information in context of the rest of the book into like a very rigid structure. That's how we used to do things. That's how books and manuals were built. Like, even when printing press, or even before the printing press was invented. So, and what the internet has been doing, and what search engines have been doing, is that we've been moving towards pages where you can just dive into any object, or any document, any book, and just find that one page where a certain concept is explained. So you can just jump in, and you don't have to read the whole book to be able to understand something.
Hmm.
And that's where we are today. But like, I think that the next step in this process, and that's also what Kevin Kelly talks about, is flows, where you have a flow of information that's much more personalized, and we're just constantly dipping in and out of these information flows around us that are serving us the documentation that we need at a certain time to be able to do what we need to do, and that are aware of our context, so that we don't have to adjust to the context of the documentation, but the documentation adjusts to our own personal context.
So,
And I think, yeah.
so what I'm hearing is you see us as you see this graph database integration and everything that you guys are building as a means to that end,
Yeah.
to get there somewhere somehow,
Yeah.
or to get closer to it.
Yeah. So we have a first customer where I've been talking about this concept, and like they're a SaaS company, and so what I imagine is that we could track users, like the administrators, as they're interacting with the software, and then basically serve them the content like this way, where you look at their whole experience inside of your tool, and then you serve them the information they need to be able to interact better and get more value out of your system. So it's kind of like the idea, the way that I describe it is going from the context of the manual to the context of one, like the one person, one single user, and how they are interacting with the system. This is very, very, like, there's a lot of work to get here. But I think that we can take like baby steps, start with a first implementation, start with just building a graph of the behavior and how people interact with documentation and with the tools that document that are documented by that documentation, and then use that to start recommending content. And yeah, I'm really excited about it. We started a mailing list about it at one of the meetups where I was presenting, and we had one of the people that worked on Clippy years and years ago at Microsoft, who was also really excited about the idea, because I think this is what Clippy wanted to do or wanted to be, but it was not possible. And I think that graph databases could be the piece of technology that enables the dream of Clippy.
Well, I think on that bombshell, I think that's a great time to kind of wrap up this podcast. Thank you so much for coming online, Kristof. We'll be publishing some more details around your work and also the talks that you've been doing with the transcription of the podcast, so people can read up about it. And I look forward to seeing you at one of our meetups, right? Because we'll be doing some community work together in the next couple of months as well. So really looking forward to that.
Likewise.
Thank you so much. Have a nice day, Kristof.
Yeah, you too.
Bye.
Bye.